For a very brief 5-day window between the 20th and 24th of February 2025, the world's most reclusive country, North Korea, opened itself up again to the first Western tourist to the country in more than 5 years. For its entire existence, North Korea has generally tended towards heavy isolationism, but then when the COVID-19 pandemic struck in early 2020, it sent North Korea's isolationism into overdrive. The country was the very first one in the world to completely seal their borders off from the outside world at the onset of the pandemic on the 21st of January 2020, and then they never allowed any Westerners to visit the country again for more than half a decade, until this recently unprecedented trip in February, where they allowed just 13 Westerners to enter the country again on a strictly controlled, limited, and guided tour of the city of Rason, in the very far northeast corner of North Korea that's just across from the tri-point border with Russia and China. No Americans were a part of the tour group, and instead, the travelers were made up of visitors hailing from the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Greece, who all crossed over into North Korea by land across the border from China. Many of the Westerners who visited North Korea during this brief trip have since uploaded videos of their experiences here on YouTube that I strongly recommend you view later, many of which have since racked up millions of views. But just as North Korea barely cracked open the door to Western tourists again after more than 5 years, allowing only a handful of people to visit just a single city right across the border from China, they slammed the door shut again just a couple of weeks later, and announced another indefinite end to Western tourism in early March, returning right back to the hyper-strict isolationism of the past 5 years, with hardly anybody from the outside world welcome to enter. As of this video's production, the North Korean government has made no further announcements or clarifications on when Westerners may be allowed to return back to the country, if ever. And at the moment, the only foreign nationality that's actually allowed to enter into the Hermit Kingdom at all are Russians, owing to the increasingly close geopolitical relationship between the Russian and North Korean governments. In February of 2024, North Korea began allowing Russian citizens to visit the country as tourists, representing the first and so far basically only foreign tourists who've been welcomed to the country since early 2020. But the numbers of Russians who've actually visited North Korea since then have been extremely low. Fewer than 900 Russians decided to actually visit North Korea throughout 2024, even though every Russian theoretically could, and those numbers don't appear to be increasing this year in 2025 either. So basically, hardly anyone at all has visited North Korea since January of 2020, and there's no clear timeline right now for when anyone other than Russians might be welcomed back again. Which is all extremely bizarre when you also consider just how much effort the North Koreans have recently put into actually trying to attract tourists to the country. It's believed that North Korea has recently invested billions of dollars into revamping their tourism sector since they closed the country down in 2020, in an apparent hope to attract huge numbers of tourists once they finally begin reopening themselves again. The regime has recently put great efforts with their limited resources into building out a brand new large-scale ski resort at Samjian just across the border from China, complete with a brand new airport and train station located directly nearby, along with a separate and massive, sprawling new beach resort on the country's east coast at Wonsan, built across a 5-kilometer-long stretch of beach with about 150 separate hotels and numerous restaurants and attractions that has been estimated to now be the largest single-owner beach resort on the entire planet. Tourism has always been attractive in North Korea because it's one of the few ways that the country can actually legally acquire desperately needed foreign currencies like dollars, euros, and yuan, since tourism is one of the few sectors that the overwhelming sanctions imposed on North Korea by the UN have never touched. Before COVID, tourism to North Korea was actually a consistently growing industry, to the point where hundreds of thousands of people visited the country in both 2018 and in 2019, before the door slammed completely shut in 2020. North Korea earned hundreds of millions of desperately needed dollars in both of those years from tourist revenue, and the regime has clearly invested billions of dollars into brand new resorts to try and return back to those numbers and even exceed them eventually. So why then has North Korea completely shut itself off from visitors from the outside world for the past half a decade, if it used to be so lucrative for them? And why did they open up just a single small border city to a small group of Western tourists in 2025, only to immediately close it again just a couple of weeks later, with no information given on when, or even if, Westerners, or anyone even besides Russians, will ever be able to enter again? Why can you, watching this video, not visit North Korea even if you wanted to? Despite North Korea's current reputation for being hyper-reclusive, it wasn't always exactly like this, and the history of the tourism industry in North Korea is probably the most bizarre and interesting of any country in the world. During the Korean War in the 1950s, North Korea's capital and largest city, Pyongyang, was largely destroyed by the fighting and was rebuilt afterwards with assistance from the Soviet Union. Throughout this period up until 1980, there were only 3 hotels that were ever built in Pyongyang, and the levels of visitors to North Korea was incredibly small. But all of that finally started changing a bit in the 1980s, when the North Korean government decided to begin adopting tourism as a major economic strategy. Most of this was because North Korea was selected to host the World Festival of Youth and Students in 1989, a left-wing festival held occasionally since 1947 in primarily communist and socialist states. To prepare for the arrival of more than 20,000 expected participants in the festival, and to show their country off on the world stage, the North Koreans knew that they needed to dramatically upgrade their tourism infrastructure from practically non-existent to something much more substantial. 3 new large-capacity hotels were planned to begin construction in Pyongyang leading up to the 1989 festival, but none of them were as grandiose and ambitious as the Ryugyong Hotel was planned to be. With construction beginning in 1987, the original plan was to finish out the hotel within 2 years by the time of the festival. Designed to soar 330 meters or 1,080 feet high, the Ryugyong Hotel was intended to become the tallest hotel in the world at the time, eclipsing what was then the record holder in Singapore, the Westin Stamford, at only 226 meters or 741 feet tall. At about the same height as the Eiffel Tower, the Ryugyong Hotel was going to be by far the tallest building in North Korea, and the centerpiece of the Kim regime's capital that they wanted to showcase to the rest of the world in 1989. It was planned to have about 3,000 rooms for guests across more than 100 floors, and the country was so proud of it that it even started appearing on North Korean postal stamps while the construction was still ongoing. Overall, the North Korean government would spend an estimated $4.5 billion over 4 years preparing the country for the 1989 festival, equivalent to nearly a quarter of the country's entire annual government budget. But when the World Festival of Youth and Students arrived in 1989, the ambitious Ryugyong Hotel in particular was still nowhere near to being completed. Nonetheless, 22,000 people from 177 countries from around the world attended the festival hosted in Pyongyang, including 100 citizens from the United States, marking the largest internationally attended festival to ever be hosted in North Korea. With the centerpiece Ryugyong Hotel unfinished, however, the plan was updated after the festival to finish the building by the time of Kim Il-sung's 80th birthday in 1992, the founder of North Korea and the country's reigning Kim dynasty. However, North Korea ended up entering into the worst economic crisis in its entire history shortly afterwards in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union was always North Korea's primary source of foreign aid and trade, and so its sudden collapse threw North Korea into a deep recession that saw the economy collapse by 25% in the early 1990s. By 1992, construction on the Ryugyong Hotel had advanced far enough to top the building out at its final intended architectural height of 330 meters. But the economic crisis that was by then enveloping the country forced the remaining construction to halt, leaving behind a colossal unfinished concrete skeleton without any windows, fixtures, or fittings that dominated the Pyongyang skyline. At the time, there were newspapers in Japan that estimated the North Korean government had already spent about $750 million on the building's construction, or about 2% of North Korea's total GDP at the time. Rather than becoming the centerpiece attraction in Pyongyang and the tallest hotel in the world like North Korea originally intended, the Ryugyong Hotel instead became the tallest abandoned building in the world for decades, and a towering monument to North Korea's economic and financial problems instead. Despite the imagined completed building initially appearing on North Korea's postage stamps, the government would later begin manipulating official photographs of Pyongyang by removing the unfinished concrete eyesore from the skyline entirely, while government-printed maps of Pyongyang simply deleted the building from existence, despite the fact that it still utterly dominated Pyongyang's skyline. For the next 16 years after 1992, the hollow concrete shell of the Ryugyong Hotel haunted the Pyongyang skyline until 2008, when an Egyptian construction company called Orascom entered into a deal with the North Korean government to finally finish it out. By then, the North Korean plan under the new leader, Kim Jong-il, was to finish the building by the time of then-deceased Kim Il-sung's 100th birthday in 2012. By mid-2011, the exterior of the hotel was finally covered with installed glass panels, and by late 2012, photographs of the hotel's interior were finally released on the internet for the very first time, which showed that it was still completely bare with no cabling, wiring, or piping. While the exterior of the hotel was finally disguised with glass, the interior of it continued remaining completely empty and hollow. In November of 2012, a German luxury hotel management company called Kempinski announced that they would be operating the Ryugyong Hotel. But then just the following year in 2013, they pulled out after North Korea successfully detonated their third nuclear weapons test, skyrocketing tensions between North Korea and the West that made operating a major hotel in Pyongyang by a Western company extremely risky. All construction on the hotel halted once again, and then some modest activity at the site was detected again between 2016 and 2018. In 2018, with the hotel still abandoned and unoccupied after more than 30 years since the construction began, the North Korean government decided, in a way, to finally begin cutting their losses on it by transforming the whole building into a gigantic electronic propaganda billboard. One of the entire sides of the building was covered in a massive LED light display that prominently displays propaganda animations and films and the waving North Korean flag that dominates the skyline at night, making it one of, if not the, largest LED billboards on the planet. Still ultimately abandoned all this time later now, nearly 40 years later after construction first began, and still dominating Pyongyang's skyline, there has never been a single guest who's ever paid to spend one night in the Ryugyong Hotel, which has earned it the infamous nickname in the international press as North Korea's Hotel of Doom. But it's far from North Korea's only failed tourism project that's been left to rot away today. Beginning in 1998, the North Korean government began specifically allowing South Korean tourists to visit a small area just across the border around Mount Kumgang, which began steadily being developed into a mountain and beach resort area jointly by both North Korean and South Korean developers. Eventually, in 2002, the North Korean government carved out a dedicated and separate administrative area in this region out of the Gangwon province that they called the Mount Kumgang Tourist Region. South Korean tourists were initially welcomed to this special zone in the north by boat at first, and then later by bus after a new road was built to it through the heavily militarized border region. The South Korean company that was tasked with developing the Mount Kumgang tourist region was a branch of the Hyundai Corporation called Hyundai Asan. They built multiple hotels, ski resorts, and golf courses in the region, and most notably, they also introduced the world's first ever floating hotel to Mount Kumgang as the resort's flagship property as well, which all on its own is an incredibly bizarre story. What would eventually become known as the Hotel Haegeumgang in North Korea in the 2000s originally began life as the 5-star Four Seasons Barrier Reef Resort in the late 1980s, the world's first ever floating hotel built over Australia's Great Barrier Reef about 70 kilometers off of the Australian coast. At a cost of about $45 million, or more than $100 million adjusted for inflation to today's money, the world's first ever floating hotel began construction in 1986 in Singapore, and was then hauled out to the Great Barrier Reef by a heavy lift ship and opened up for business in 1988. However, it wouldn't end up lasting very long here. While the hotel's creators envisioned it as a diving and snorkeling paradise within the Great Barrier Reef, it was immediately beset by a host of unforeseen problems. The only way to get out to the hotel was by boat or helicopter, while frequent bad weather in the region prevented either from being able to move for long stretches of time, stranding guests at the hotel until the weather had passed. It also just turned out that there wasn't really that much else to do at the hotel other than dive or snorkel, which got old faster than the creators had anticipated. A cyclone hit the hotel just a week after it opened, permanently damaging the freshwater pool that was a part of the resort, while a significant ammunition dump left over from the Second World War was also quickly discovered just a couple of miles away from the hotel, which began scaring people away. So within just a year from opening, the hotel was already in dire financial straits, and so it was sold to another company in Vietnam in 1989 that relocated it about 3,400 miles northward to Ho Chi Minh City, where it became that city's first 5-star hotel and initially a great financial success. It was renamed to the Saigon Floating Hotel and stayed moored in the Saigon River for nearly another decade, until it once again began running into financial difficulties in 1998 and was forced to shut down. The original plan at the time was to just dismantle the structure, but this was also the exact same year that the North Koreans opened up the Mount Kumgang tourist region to large-scale tourism from South Korea. Hyundai Asan, who was building out the resort area, discovered that the floating hotel in Vietnam had just shut down, and decided that buying it and towing it from Vietnam to North Korea was going to be cheaper and easier than starting a brand new construction project in North Korea from scratch. So, Hyundai Asan then bought the floating hotel for around $18 million, just 40% of its original construction price, towed it back to where it was built in Singapore for repairs and renovations, and then towed it up to the Mount Kumgang tourist region in North Korea to begin its third and most bizarre final phase of life. For a long time, the Mount Kumgang resort area was the most successful attempt at tourism that North Korea has so far ever managed to accomplish. Over a 10-year period between 1998 and 2008, nearly 2 million South Korean tourists came to visit the resort, fewer than the 4.9 million visitors that North Korea initially wanted to come by 2004, but still a large number of people who came that injected a large amount of foreign currency into the North Korean economy, since they forbade the use of North Korea's currency at the resort and mandated that everyone who visited it spend only US dollars or Chinese yuan. It was all going fairly well until it suddenly wasn't. In July of 2008, a 53-year-old South Korean woman who was visiting the Mount Kumgang resort, named Park Wang-ja, was shot twice and killed by a North Korean soldier. North Korea claimed that she had wandered off from the resort area and entered into an off-limits military area, and that she ignored multiple warnings to turn around and was shot at while running. South Korea requested a joint inquiry into the nature of her death, which North Korea rejected. Later forensic testing conducted on Park's body in South Korea suggested that she was either standing still or was walking very slowly when she was shot and killed by the North Korean soldier, directly contradicting the North's characterization of events. That shooting spiked tensions between the Koreas again, and South Korea announced immediately afterward that they were suspending all of their tours to the Mount Kumgang tourist resort. A couple years later, in 2010, North Korea unilaterally began seizing and nationalizing Hyundai Asan's assets and properties in the resort area, claiming that it was compensation for the damage the South did to the North by suspending tours to the resort for years. The incident ended up costing Hyundai Asan hundreds of millions of dollars in lost investments, and it profoundly scared almost anyone rational from ever wanting to invest in North Korea again. To date, ever since, access to the Kumgang resort area has been continually blocked off from the South Korean side. Most of the buildings began being demolished in 2022, including the goofy floating hotel, and in 2024, North Korea dissolved the Mount Kumgang tourist region altogether and reincorporated the whole region back into the Gangwon province just like it used to be prior to 1998, suggesting that the whole experiment here of allowing in large numbers of South Korean tourists is probably permanently over. Tourism in North Korea, in general, was pursued slowly and haphazardly under the first two rulers of the Kim dynasty, Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il. But after Kim Jong-il died in 2011 and his son took over, Kim Jong-un, he initially began pursuing a radically different approach. Educated abroad in the West in Switzerland, Kim Jong-un declared a new policy for North Korea called Byungjin in 2013, which called for simultaneously advancing the country's nuclear weapons capabilities with further economic development too, and with tourism remaining one of the very few industries not subjected to the UN's international sanctions on North Korea related to their nuclear weapons program. Kim Jong-un decided to try and return back towards the tourism strategy again, to try and attain that needed economic development and to acquire hard foreign currencies. Through the rest of the 2010s, Kim Jong-un commissioned multiple major tourist projects across the country, including a new airport, skating and amusement parks, a new dolphinarium in the capital Pyongyang, a new hot spring cultural recreation center at Yangdok, and the first public North Korean ski resort at Masakryong, complete with a retired Austrian gondola lift that was provided to them by China, who uniquely interpreted that the international sanctions on North Korea excluded ski equipment from the banned luxury category. Largest of all, Kim also began the construction of the massive Wonsan Kalma luxury beach resort in 2014 as well. Initially planned to be opened by 2019 and currently scheduled to be finally open soon over the summer of 2025. In all, Kim Jong-un is believed to have invested an estimated $7.8 billion into renovating the country's hotels and building up new tourism amenities since he took over power. An astonishing fortune for North Korea that's equivalent to about 1/4 of the nation's annual GDP. And to an extent, Kim's tourism strategy was just starting to work out and pay back dividends before everything shut down during the COVID-19 pandemic. Appealing primarily to the Chinese tourist market, which was beginning to grow rapidly in the 2010s alongside China's economic ascendancy, roughly 100,000 tourists visited North Korea in 2014. 95% of all those tourists were Chinese, meaning that only around 5,000 non-Chinese tourists visited North Korea throughout that year, a pattern that would generally hold steady for years. North Korea is believed to have earned around $44 million in tourism income from those 100,000 visitors in 2014. And the numbers of visitors and cash earned remained roughly the same in 2015, 2016, and in 2017 as well. However, after Kim Jong-un attempted to lead North Korea through a period of opening up to the Trump administration in South Korea in 2018, China lifted some of its bans on its citizens traveling to North Korea in the same year. And so, the numbers of tourists visiting North Korea briefly skyrocketed. It's probable that around 200,000 tourists visited North Korea in 2018. And an all-time high record number of at least 350,000 Chinese tourists alone visited North Korea in 2019, that generated around $175 million in revenue for the country. And while few Westerners were visiting North Korea during this time, there were still a few. And it was still possible for you to have done so if you felt brave enough, and were okay enough with the government's heavy restrictions placed upon you while visiting. There were multiple North Korea tourism agencies operating at this time that would take curious and adventurous Western tourists to the capital Pyongyang via a flight on the North Korean national airline from Beijing. Despite numerous travel advisories from nearly every Western country against their citizens doing this, what you were actually allowed to bring with you into the country was tightly controlled and regulated. Satellite phones and later drones were strictly banned to bring with you. Other technological devices that could carry banned content on them like USB drives, CDs, smartphones, laptops, tablets, and cameras were rigorously investigated and gone through by North Korean customs officials upon your arrival. Content that was strictly banned to bring with you included South Korean dramas and television shows, any content related to literally any religion, pornography, and anything deemed to be remotely critical of the Kim dynasty and the North Korean government. Travel guides about North Korea, South Korea, or Japan were all banned as well, and so was any Western printed literature about North Korea at all. Once you arrived, spending money in North Korea also worked completely differently than in any other country as well. Because of the crushing international financial sanctions that were placed on the country, debit and credit cards and traveler's checks all wouldn't work, and transferring money electronically to any of your accounts while you were in North Korea was virtually impossible. This meant that you couldn't use any ATMs while you were in North Korea. So, you needed to bring all the money you wanted to spend there in physical currency. Interestingly, North Korea also banned every tourist who visited the country from actually using the North Korean currency. Everybody who visited the country was only allowed to spend foreign currencies like euros, dollars, or yuan, so that North Korea could build up their foreign currency reserves. Once you arrived in Pyongyang, you were assigned a personal North Korean tour guide who would shadow you everywhere you went, and only take you where you were supposed to go and show you what you were supposed to see. They also had the job of making sure that you, as a guest, never stepped remotely out of line while visiting. The Swedish diplomatic mission to North Korea represents most other Western country citizens while they're in North Korea, and they've consistently advised that there is very little tolerance for tourists who display what the government deems to be disruptive behaviors. Talking to North Korean citizens or wandering off without explicit permission from your assigned tour guide, or taking photos of areas without their permission is often considered by the government to be spying, and will usually be punished as such. Before taking photos or videos of anything in North Korea, you always needed to ask your designated tour guide for permission first. And if you didn't and you got caught, you might have ended up getting literally treated as a foreign spy. Showing contempt for the Kim family or North Korea's political symbols was also regarded as being extremely offensive, while tourists were always frequently reminded to never ever refer to the country the way that we most often do in the West as North Korea while they're there, and to use the country's preferred official name of the DPRK, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea instead. And there were many, many horror stories of specifically American tourists visiting North Korea throughout the years that got any number of these restrictions wrong and faced the regime's wrath. Some of the most notable recent examples included people like Evan Hunziker, who back over the summer of 1996 was in China on the North Korean border and drinking alcohol. While intoxicated, he was allegedly dared by a supposed friend to swim across the Yalu River into North Korea, which he did. Once on the other side, he was promptly arrested by North Korean border guards, and he became the first American civilian to be formally charged with espionage by North Korea since the end of the Korean War, a charge that could have given him the death penalty. He ultimately spent 3 months in North Korean custody before being released through negotiation efforts. In January of 2010, an American Christian missionary named Ajalon Gomez decided that he was going to try and enter North Korea in order to spread his faith. He initially tried to cross the border from South Korea through the DMZ, but quickly found out that that just wasn't going to be possible. So instead, he flew up to the Yanji Chaoyangchuan Airport in China, near the northern border, and then traveled to the Chinese city of Tumen, directly across the border from North Korea. He just walked across the river there as it was frozen, and was similarly immediately arrested by North Korean border guards. He was later sentenced to 8 years of hard labor, and as relations between North Korea and the United States deteriorated later that year, the regime threatened to apply martial law to him that could have carried the death penalty. Official negotiations to secure his release failed, which led to former US President Jimmy Carter deciding to fly to North Korea personally to negotiate his release instead, which was ultimately successful after Gomez was held for nearly 8 months. But, suffering from severe PTSD due to his time in North Korean custody, Gomez would tragically take his own life 7 years later after being released. In May of 2014, an American named Jeffrey Edward Fowl was legally visiting North Korea as a tourist. But while he was visiting the northern Korean port city of Cheongjin on his tour, he deliberately left behind a Korean-language Bible in the bathroom of the Cheongjin Sailors Club, violating North Korea's extremely strict laws on religious proselytism. A staff member later discovered the Bible and handed it over to the authorities. So when Fowl was back at the international airport in Pyongyang just about to leave the country with his tour group, authorities approached and arrested him. He was then held in North Korean custody for the next 5 months before his release was successfully negotiated by Sweden. And then, just a couple years later, came the most public and infamous visit to North Korea by a tourist from the United States. In late 2015, Otto Warmbier was a 21-year-old American college student who was about to embark on a study abroad program in Hong Kong. Before he made it to Hong Kong, he decided to book a New Year's tour to North Korea along the way through a North Korean budget tour company called Young Pioneer Tours that was based in China. On the 29th of December of 2015, Warmbier and 10 other US citizens flew from Beijing to Pyongyang on the North Korean national airline to participate in what was supposed to be a 5-day guided tour across the North Korean capital. However, late on the evening of New Year's Eve after a night of drinking alcohol, Warmbier allegedly wandered off from his assigned tour guide and entered into a restricted staff-only area on the second floor of the hotel he was staying at, where he attempted to take a North Korean propaganda poster featuring the image of the former leader Kim Jong-il off of the wall to take back home as a souvenir. But realizing that the poster was too big to fit into his luggage, he then left the poster behind damaged on the floor, and returned back to his room. The next morning on the 1st of January, a hotel staff member entered into the room and discovered the poster damaged and placed on the floor, and interpreted it as a deliberate subversive act to tear the poster down. The following day on the 2nd, while Warmbier and his tour group were at the airport in Pyongyang all about to leave back to Beijing, North Korean police approached his group, tapped Warmbier on the shoulder, and then led him away. The rest of his group would never see him again, and the rest of them were allowed to leave on the plane without any further incident. North Korea later said that Warmbier had been detained for committing a hostile action against the state. And then several weeks later, he appeared in a North Korean press conference and read from a prepared statement, in which he confessed to attempting to steal the propaganda poster from his hotel at the behest of a Methodist church in his hometown that was allegedly allied with the CIA. During a very brief public 1-hour trial in March, a North Korean court found Warmbier guilty of the crime of subversion and sentenced him to 15 years of hard labor in a prison camp, despite his pleas for mercy and the US government's request for his release. Eventually, 17 months after Warmbier was arrested and imprisoned, in June of 2017, the new Trump administration announced that they had finally managed to secure his release. North Korean officials claimed that shortly after his sentencing, Warmbier was given a sleeping pill which sent him into a coma, and that he had contracted foodborne botulism. When he was handed back over to American authorities, he was trapped in a vegetative comatose state that the North Korean authorities claimed he'd been stuck in for more than a year since April of 2016. American doctors found no evidence for botulism in Warmbier and no evidence of physical abuse or torture either. But brain scans did reveal that he had suffered extensive loss of tissue throughout his brain, indicating that a cardiopulmonary event had taken place that caused his brain to be momentarily deprived of oxygen, possibly triggered by a cardiac arrest. 6 days later, after Otto Warmbier was released, his parents requested that his feeding tube be removed, and he died shortly afterwards, triggering a sharp diplomatic response by the United States. The US State Department decided after the Otto Warmbier incident to ban the validity of US passports for any travel to North Korea, meaning that since September of 2017 to the present day, US passports have not been valid for travel to North Korea unless given special validation beforehand. meaning that even if you still wanted to visit North Korea as a US citizen for some reason, it's been basically impossible for you to do so since 2017. And then after the COVID-19 pandemic began, it's almost been impossible for anyone else to ever visit either. Even before COVID began, though, North Korea was already starting to show increasingly isolationist tendencies as world events were changing the regime's calculus on allowing guests in. The failure of Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump's summit in Hanoi in 2019 destroyed any chance of the sanctions on North Korea being lifted anytime soon, which sent the regime into a much more hardline isolationist stance. It was noted that at many of the hotels for international tourists in Pyongyang in 2019, the government began installing special screens to the windows of high-story rooms that obscured the views of anything going on in the city below. While at the Juche Tower in central Pyongyang, one of North Korea's greatest monuments, a ban on photography from the tower's viewing platform located just beneath the torch was imposed to further block out any outside views into the city's life. And then, of course, came the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020, which supercharged North Korea's growing isolationism from the outside world even further. Just as the tourism numbers were starting to sort of boom in North Korea with large numbers of Chinese tourist arrivals in 2018 and 2019, the country completely sealed off their borders to everyone from the outside world beginning on the 21st of January 2020. And with only very limited and few exceptions, they've kept them completely shut ever since. Nonetheless, North Korea did begin making preparations for a return back to large-scale tourism again in 2022, just a couple years into their full-on self-imposed isolation. Kim Jong-un personally visited the long-abandoned Mount Kumgang resort just across the border from South Korea, and heavily criticized the state of disrepair that the resort's facilities had found themselves in. He ordered sweeping demolitions across the resort, including of the strange floating hotel that had been by then abandoned for the past 14 years, and for new, modern facilities to take their place. Though to date, no new construction has been spotted by satellites here. A resumption of work on the Wonsan Kalma Beach Resort and other resorts were also ordered in early 2022 to prepare the country for its eventual reopening to tourism. But North Korea could have never predicted then that a much more financially lucrative door was about to open for them that also didn't involve any of the risks associated with tourists spreading intellectual contagion to the North Korean public. Russia's war in Ukraine and the Russian war machine's insatiable need for materials and soldiers. To put the scale of this new opportunity into perspective for you, remember that North Korea probably earned around $175 million from Chinese tourism in 2019, its highest ever pull from the tourism industry to the country. But just in the past couple of years since 2023 though, when North Korea began selling artillery shells, missiles, ammunition, and other material to Russia, they've probably earned as much as $5.5 billion doing that. A huge economic windfall equal to nearly 1/5 of the country's entire GDP, and more than 31 times what they earned from Chinese tourism across 2019. Escalating things even further in 2024, North Korea began sending thousands of their own soldiers to Russia to fight against the Ukrainians on the battlefield, effectively as state-sponsored mercenaries, which has been projected to earn the North Korean government another $572 million a year in revenue. Still much more on its own than they were ever receiving from tourism. And beyond the monetary compensation, Russia has further rewarded North Korea for their assistance against Ukraine in multiple other ways as well, including by sharing advanced military technologies and assisting with North Korea's missile program, diplomatically supporting North Korea at the United Nations and voting against further sanctions, and even signing a new military alliance pact in 2024 that now legally binds Russia to militarily support North Korea in the event of a foreign attack. Thus, even though North Korea continued walling itself off to tourists from anywhere else, it started making geopolitical sense for them to begin allowing Russian tourists into the country starting in 2024, following the radically shifted relationship, making the Russians the first outsiders welcomed to the country in more than 4 years. Nonetheless, the Russian tourists to the country have been faced with the same kinds of restrictions that tourists to North Korea were always faced with beforehand. They're limited to guided tours that only show them what the regime wants to be shown, and are generally restricted to just Pyongyang and limited tourist resorts across the country. And their numbers, by all accounts, have fallen well below North Korea's expectations, with only 880 Russian tourist arrivals to the country throughout all of 2024, barely enough to even register on a macroeconomic scale. This whole time, though, North Korea was preparing their limited experiment to begin accepting Western tourists to the country again, too. They had set up a small, special economic zone called Rason in the far northeast of the country, just across the border from China and Russia, that they would open up to very limited numbers of tourists from the west, a very small peek through the window into North Korea. The single tour that made it, that included 13 Westerners who visited North Korea in early 2025, was entirely restricted to being just within this small zone around Rason. And North Korea's decision to end the tours immediately afterwards probably rests on two key problems that North Korea has with welcoming tourists back to the country now that they didn't really used to have prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first issue is that social media today is way more powerful and influential than it was 6 years ago, the last time North Korea was welcoming in Western tourists back in 2019. And the regime seems to have probably greatly underestimated that. Back in 2019 and before, outsiders who traveled to North Korea were usually restricted to documenting their experiences on niche blogs or media companies that usually didn't attract mass appeal or interest. But since 2019, YouTube alone has gained 35% more users, while the advertising revenue on this site has more than doubled, giving significantly greater incentives to post content and more chances that unique content, such as being the first Westerners to visit and film themselves in North Korea in more than 5 years, will end up being viewed by a lot of people. North Korea was always cautious about vetting any visitors to the country, and was perennially afraid of trained journalists with advanced equipment entering who disguise themselves as tourists. But now, in the world of super advanced smartphones and the huge increases in video platforms like YouTube and TikTok post-pandemic, virtually anybody has the capability to be a journalist now, or to at least have the capability to reach a huge audience filming what they see. And the evidence of this can be seen by the huge success on YouTube that these few Western tourists to visit North Korea in early 2025 have experienced. In just a matter of weeks, this video from the channel Ale Solvino got more than 600,000 views. This video from the channel Tamil Trekker got more than 1.7 million views. This video from the channel Ojwashtech gained more than 4.6 million views. And this video from Mike OK gained more than 7.8 million views. All of them are fantastic videos with amazing insights into life in North Korea today. But the fact that they all racked up so many views so quickly and that they don't exactly show North Korea in the way that the regime's propaganda probably wants was almost certainly deeply embarrassing to North Korean officials. The regime knew how to restrict professional journalists in the past, but today, the massive amounts of video that can be filmed by anybody visiting and viewed by millions of people makes it much more difficult for North Korea to actually control what information leaves the country. North Korea likely decided to suspend the brief tourism experiment that they started in Rason until they can figure out new ways to further restrict what information actually leaves the country with tourists. And the second related issue for North Korean officials to worry about now is the much higher risk of foreign tourists spreading sensitive information and knowledge about the outside world to North Korean citizens, especially relating to North Korea's involvement in Russia's war on Ukraine. So far, North Korean propagandists have very carefully kept the fact that thousands of North Korean men have been deployed to fight and die against Ukraine, a closely guarded secret hidden from the public. Ukrainian and South Korean intelligence believe that around 1,000 North Korean soldiers have already been killed in action on the battlefield in Europe, and around another 3,000 others wounded. Based on multiple intelligence reports and accounts of North Korean soldiers captured by the Ukrainians, the North Korean soldiers and their families were either never informed beforehand that they were being deployed to fight against the Ukrainians over on the other side of the world, or they were lied to that they would be fighting against South Korean soldiers allegedly fighting on the Ukrainian side of the war, while they also allegedly received orders from their superiors to commit suicide rather than be captured alive. The regime has kept the deployment and the casualties suffered around Ukraine a closely guarded secret from the North Korean public, fearful of what resentment their sacrifices might cause for a war with no clear ideological or defense justifications from North Korea's perspective. Early in 2025, in order to replace their casualties, North Korea is believed to have deployed a few thousand more soldiers to Russia by ship from the regime port, notably located only about 5 kilometers away from the special tourism zone in Rason that they welcomed the small group of Western tourists to. The regime's need to withhold this information from its people continues growing higher, and there's a major risk that Western, or really any non-Russian tourists, may end up spreading that news while visiting, which to the regime is far more dangerous than even the spread of any infectious disease. There's a very, very interesting moment from Mike Okay's video that he filmed in North Korea, where he visits the North Korea-Russia Friendship House, and he writes in the visitor's book that he wished for world peace, which greatly upset his North Korean guide and got him scolded. Probably because the regime is extremely sensitive right now about its involvement in casualties in Russia's war on Ukraine, and doesn't want any information about it getting into the country. Why would somebody wish for world peace in the North Korea-Russia house, after all, if there wasn't already peace? Merely wishing for world peace indicated that there was not peace, and could have led to uncomfortable questions as to where thousands of North Korean soldiers have gone off to. That incident, along with others, probably convinced the North Korean regime that for now, the risks of this knowledge getting into North Korea through Western tourists, along with the risks of those same tourists taking out unflattering videos of North Korean society with them, was not worth the minuscule financial returns on tourism compared with their massive financial returns that they're still getting by supporting the Russian war machine. The more soldiers and material that the North Koreans send to Russia, the bigger the need to hide it from their own people will become, and the less likely it will be that the regime will ever reopen itself back up to foreign tourists who know all about it again anytime soon. And this includes Chinese tourists too, who used to make up the backbone of North Korea's tourism industry. So even though Kim Jong-un invested billions of dollars into upgrading North Korea's tourism facilities prior to 2022, he never could have foreseen the other opportunity that would arise with Russia's war in Ukraine, and the much more lucrative way to earn money supporting them without the same kinds of risks of allowing in foreign tourists and exposing them and their outside knowledge to North Korean citizens. Keeping the country open to Russian tourists will continue making geopolitical sense for the regime to maintain, and their numbers and the language barrier are low enough anyway that they're not a very significant cause for concern. But so long as Russia's war in Ukraine continues and North Korea continues to make money hand over fist supporting it, they're very unlikely to reopen the country back up to significant outside tourism again, especially from the West after what appears to be a failed experiment at the Rason Special Economic Zone earlier this year. It is possible, though, that with the grand opening of the Wonsan Kalma Beach Resort scheduled for this upcoming summer, North Korea is preparing themselves for tourism again after the Ukraine wars ended. And they'll likely use that Rason experiment with those few Western tourists to devise methods to further control the experience of tourists while they're in the country, and to further restrict what they're allowed to take out with them. North Korea remains, as they have for decades, ultimately trapped in a sort of catch-22 situation when it comes to the tourism industry. Trapped between their desire to acquire vitally needed foreign currencies and their fear of welcoming in foreign influence that could disrupt the regime's totalitarian control over its population. A problem that will persist for as long as the Kim dynasty remains in power, and why for the moment, you are not welcome to visit North Korea. Like a lot of stuff going on in the world right now, though, this situation with tourism to North Korea is very much in a state of flux, and can change again at almost any moment. Since he returned back to the White House, Donald Trump has said that American communication with North Korea is ongoing, and that he plans to reach out to Kim Jong-un again at some point, setting the stage for another round of negotiations between the US and North Korea soon, where Kim could try and use North Korea's tourism potential and its support of Russia's war in Ukraine as points of leverage. It wasn't that long ago, back in 2018 after all, where, during a speech, Trump praised North Korea's great beaches and potential for condos and hotels. And with Trump back in office again today, there's almost no end to the extent of global chaos being caused and no limit to what's possible. Every month that's happening right now seems to have more major historical events crammed into them than entire years did in the 2000s and 2010s. And I love to dive deep into this new chaotic world of global geopolitics in my series War Room. This is my series where I explain every major development that's happened in ongoing conflicts from around the world that you should know about on a monthly basis. From the Russia-Ukraine war and North Korea's involvement in it, to the Israel-Gaza war, America's renewed bombing campaign in Yemen, the Myanmar civil war, and others. Just in this past month, there are several major things that happen in all of these conflicts that you should be aware about if you want to be a globally informed citizen. From Russian and North Korean forces nearly ejecting the Ukrainians from their occupied territory in Kursk, to a catastrophic earthquake rocking Myanmar in the middle of its civil war, to Israel shattering the ceasefire in Gaza and restarting its total war there against Hamas. War Room summarizes all of these critical breaking events taking place around the world every single month for you in easily digestible videos. And if you're interested, War Room can be found exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is also the home to other incredible original content from your favorite creators, including my other series Modern Conflicts, which was created for people like you who are interested in deeper dives into recent wars, military operations, and conflicts that have taken place since the 1980s that wouldn't ever work on YouTube, because they'd be instantly demonetized and age-restricted due to their highly sensitive and violent subject material. I've been uploading one new Modern Conflicts episode per month to Nebula for more than 4 years now, which means that there's currently nearly 50 episodes in this series that you can only find on Nebula, with new episodes still coming out every single month, including this episode that covers the entire modern history of violence and fighting between North Korea and South Korea in the 21st century, and this episode that dives deeper into Ukraine's invasion of Kursk that precipitated North Korea's direct military involvement there later. Nebula is my own independent creator-owned streaming platform that's co-owned by myself and hundreds of other independent creators. There's no studio executives who decide what gets the green light, and there's no advertisements either, which is what enables me to create content that I actually want to create, like Modern Conflicts and War Room there, without fear of being censored, demonetized, or age-restricted like on YouTube. And beyond myself, it's a streaming site for hundreds of other independent creators to make the projects that they're excited about too, with as few barriers between you and us as possible. And that's why there's tons of other new unique content on there that's coming out all the time that you'll also love from creators like Wendover Productions, Neo, and TLDR News, among so many others. I also know that there's a lot of streaming platforms out there right now and you don't want to get stuck with another monthly cost to keep track of. But I also know that if you watch this through all the way to the end, there is so much content on Nebula that you'll love as well, and so much more coming out with every new month, that you could consider a lifetime membership to Nebula instead. You just pay once, and then you'll get lifetime access to everything that I and hundreds of other creators will ever produce on Nebula for as long as we both last, and you'll never have to worry about a recurring subscription or ads ever again. That's the best way possible to support what I'm doing here on Real Life Lore. But even if you'd rather not make that large of an upfront commitment, you can still help support me by signing up for a yearly or monthly subscription to Nebula as well, which you can get for a fantastic deal with 40% off by scanning the QR code or clicking the button here on your screen right now, or by following the link that's down below in the description. Any of which will get you access to everything on Nebula for the very low price of just $3 per month. I hope that you'll consider subscribing, and as always, thank you so much for watching.